Hello, I'm Janice Hahn, and I have represented the harbor area for over 20 years as a city councilwoman, a member of Congress, and now as Los Angeles County Supervisor. It's been my pleasure to be the inaugural sponsor of Stories of the Los Angeles Harbor Area for yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the first oral history project created by the County of Los Angeles. There are now 3 volumes of stories about life in the harbor area. The goal of this oral history video project is to gather stories from a variety of people and perspectives that capture significant memories and observations about the people, neighborhoods, events, friendships, and families that have made the Los Angeles harbor area such a special place in the California and American landscape. This composite film from volumes 2 and 3 features stories that are unscripted and are told by those who have lived and worked in the harbor communities. They recount their memories and reflect on how things have changed over their lifetimes. The history of the harbor area is vast and varied and deserves to be preserved for posterity, especially as we lose members of the greatest generation and their children advance in age. I'm so proud to be a sponsor of this meaningful oral history project, and I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy these amazing stories.
My favorite kind of bars are dive bars. I think San Pedro's had some of the best ones ever. And unfortunately, we're in times now where we've lost a lot of them. And I mean, I can go through the list: Rebels, and the Village Pub, and the Porthole, Tommy's Yacht Club, Mules, TC's. All these places are gone. They were the most amazing dives around. We still have Godmothers, which is good. I really miss Tommy's Yacht Club. It was the first bar I ever had a drink at legally in San Pedro. It was just the coolest place. It had a good feel to it. I'll never forget that old jukebox they had in there, and just places like that live on forever. Rebels was just closed recently. You go in there and play shuffleboard and just hang out. And these bars were great because you could go in there with $10 and have a great time, because they over-poured your drink a little bit. They were only $4.50 to begin with, so you could get 2 drinks, still give her a tip, and walk out feeling good after $10. I worked at the Village Pub for a while. My dad and the owner were really close, and he said, I need someone to do IDs. Can you come just card people at the door? I said, sure, I can come card people at the door, no problem. So I go and card people at the door, and half of them gave me a hard time because they're like, who's this 21-year-old guy asking me for my ID? But, I had to do it. I can't let you in. Not that I was big enough to stop anyone, but I tried. But before you know it, it would get so busy, I ended up behind the bar half the time, helping the bartender, whether it was just opening beers or cashing people out, making change, anything. But my favorite dive bars were the ones downtown. Tommy's Yacht Club, the Porthole, and then Godmother's around on 7th. One of my favorite dive bar moments, and I may not have been 21 at the time, but I was in a dive bar. I won't say which one. And they did last call about 1:30. And, we got our last round. And then about 1:50, the bartender came around and he said, are you staying or going? And I said, what? He said, are you staying or are you going? And I said, well, and my friend jumps in. He goes, we're staying. Okay. And he carried on and he asked the next table. And I looked at my friend. I said, what's going on here? Next thing you know, 2:00 comes, door shut, locked. We're inside the bar still. Anyone want another drink? Okay, so we're having another round and then another round. I think we walked out at 3:30 or 4. This happened more than once. And I said, is this how it works? Is this, I definitely wasn't 21. And I said, is this how the night scene works down here? And my friend goes, just roll with it. I said, okay. So we rolled with it. Well, a few weeks later, on a night we weren't in there, I heard the cops came busting into the place. So we actually got away with it. But it was just some fun times downtown at those bars. And, sometimes you just right place, right time.
after college, I got into the publishing industry and worked in publishing for a number of years. I owned a college media marketing company that had done a deal with a .com company based in Texas, and we were planning on rolling out this big national college media company with a magazine and other stuff that we were going to be doing. Well, like many .coms of that era, the company went out of business. It was just, we hit the .com bubble and it burst. And now I was out of a job and needing to find something to do. And I noticed that the Press Telegram had a new publication that was called U, which was like for university. And I thought, okay, well, they're doing something that's kind of in my wheelhouse. I just had a college media marketing company. I'll see if they might need some help. So I reached out to Ian Lamont, who was the publisher at the Press Telegram at the time, and said, hey, if there's anything you need, I can probably help you out here. He said, well, we really don't need help on you, but we are starting a magazine division that we need somebody to head up, and we're going to do specialty magazines and community magazines. Would you be interested? And I needed a job and sounded great. So I said, sure, I'd love to do that. So I get hired, and I get to the Press Telegram, and my first day, they pull me in for a meeting with the advertising director and Ian, the publisher, and they say, well, here's what we're thinking. We're thinking that the first thing you're going to do is start this magazine called Lakewood, for Lakewood, a monthly magazine for Lakewood. Now, nothing against the community of Lakewood, but I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, I did not get hired at the Press Telegram to start a community magazine for Lakewood. It was just, I was almost ready to quit on the spot. And I think they could tell that I was not very inspired by their idea. And they said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, San Pedro would be a pretty good place for a monthly magazine. What about San Pedro? So they said, well, look, if you think a magazine can work in San Pedro, go out and do the research. Find out from the community if they could sustain a monthly magazine, if the businesses would be able to buy the ads to make it a go. So I went out to do my research, and I met with a bunch of people in town to ask them if they felt like, this could happen. And every single person I went to said, no, we don't think the businesses will support something like this. There's just not enough advertising dollars in this community to support a monthly magazine. Others have tried and they haven't been successful. So I went back to the Press Telegram. I had my meeting, and they asked me, and they go, what did you find out? I said, I found out that people think it's going to go great. It's going to be like so wildly successful that they just can't wait for me to get started. And they're like, really? They're that excited about it? I go, I can't believe how excited people were for this magazine. We got to do San Pedro. So essentially, I put myself on the line there because I knew that if this thing didn't succeed, I'd end up getting fired. Or if not fired, laid off, or maybe they'd make me go do Lakewood, which I really didn't want to do. Again, all apologies to the people of Lakewood. And I go out, and lo and behold, everybody who told me it couldn't work was wrong. It really did. Everything I told those guys, obviously not being truthful, turned out to be truthful. I had really great support. People were so excited. People were so appreciative. People would literally stop me in the street who I didn't know and thank me for starting this magazine, because there had not been there had been one other publication that was an alternative weekly in the community. Other than that, there hadn't been anything since the days of the news pilot. So people were very excited. Well, anyways, cut to 3 years later, and I now was kind of getting burnt out at the Press Telegram, to be very honest. I felt like I wanted to do more and be this division head of a magazine division and do all the things that they talked about, and they were not in a growth mode at the time. They were sort of cutting budgets, and so any growth opportunities were not there, and I decided it was time for me to move on. But I didn't want the magazine to die. I really wanted this thing to continue, so I went to the new publisher, a guy named Mark Stevens, said, Mark, listen, I'm probably going to move on, but I really want to keep San Pedro magazine going. What do you think? And he says, look, if you can find a replacement, let's do it. Why would we throw that revenue away? So I ended up going on a search of different folks to hire my replacement. And there's a guy named Josh Stecker who came in, and he was clearly the guy who should get the job. So we hired Josh, and I stuck around for another 3 months to train him and sort of transition so that I would, teach him the ropes and he could take the magazine and run with it after I left. And so after I left, he continued to operate San Pedro magazine. And sure enough, as I could probably see the writing on the wall when I was at the Press Telegram, a couple years later, they decided they were going to fold the magazine, and that would be the end of it. And Josh at the time was now going to be out of a job, but worse than that, this monthly magazine that our community loved so much was going to die with him being, let go. And so instead of letting it go, he basically very quickly scrambled together some resources and closed San Pedro magazine, and a month or two later reopened it as San Pedro Today, which is still in operation to this day. And I'm really, really thankful to Josh for doing that, because it's just so wonderful that our community does have this monthly magazine. And I think he's done a wonderful job. And it's not an easy business by anybody who's done it, they can tell you. But I'm really proud to have been the person who first started it, but I'm equally proud of him for what he's done to keep it going, and many, many, many years longer than that I was doing it.
I believe, and I always tell people, that Wilmington saved the Union during the Civil War. If you remember, there was a blockade, and Abraham Lincoln had ordered a blockade of the South. England was suffering big time because they couldn't get the cotton to make denim, which was their big product at the time. And so their economy was suffering. The Queen of England, Queen Victoria, sends a message to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, and says, if you can create a port where we can do trade with you, we will recognize the South or the Confederacy and come to your defense. So they couldn't do anything at the South because there was a blockade. So Jefferson Davis and others knew that there was a lot of Confederacy sympathizers in California, not because they supported slavery, because they supported states' rights. In 1859, California voted to create 2 states and send it to the Senate, who rejected it. So they felt like their rights weren't being listened to. So there was a lot of Confederate sympathizers in present-day El Monte and La Puente. So Jefferson Davis sends an emissary to come out here and build a port in Los Angeles because there's all these sympathizers. Abraham Lincoln finds out, and the Union Army does the exact same thing. Phineas Banning, who was a strong Unionist, sold his land for $1 to the Union Army. His business partner, B.D. Wilson, was a strong Confederate person, but he was a businessman. He knew that if we do this here, they're going to have to use our port to bring commerce. We will be the person that transports their business. So the Union set up a port in Los Angeles, in Wilmington. The Confederacy could not do it. Queen Victoria was never able to recognize the Confederacy, and the rest is history. Had the Confederacy been able to create a port here, the country would have been very different than what it is today. So that's why I tell everybody that Wilmington, California saved the Union in the Civil War.
I was selling newspapers on the waterfront along Harbor Boulevard and Beacon Street and Front Street, along with some other boys, 4 or 5 other boys. And then one day the boys told me that they had gone to the house of our boss, the guy that gave us the newspapers to sell. He took them to his house to swim in a pool. And I said, I didn't know anything about that. I never went. And they said, well, and these boys are white. And they told me that, well, he told us not to tell you because you're colored and colored people can't come into his neighborhood in Torrance. And so that was a personal vendetta with me in terms of discrimination. But also San Pedro over the years in the 1940s and 1950s had redlining for housing. The rule was no blacks south of 6th Street, no blacks west of Gaffey, although there were a few west of Gaffey. And that was based upon the redlining by then realtors. I'm certain all of them have passed away now, so I can just say that. As a matter of fact, my first house that I purchased in San Pedro, the realtor, I was single, I'm about ready to get married. The realtor took me there, met me there at midnight, told me to come at midnight, and this is interesting, to park my car a couple of houses up, and then coast down the hill to the house and stop in front of the house. Don't slam the door, get out, and walk up and knock on the door. And I did that, and the house, all the lights in the house were out, and the owner was there, the seller of the house was there, and the realtor was there. And they took me in with a little flashlight and showed me the interior of the house, took me out and showed me the backyard. and said, this is a white neighborhood and they don't want you here, but these people want to sell the house to you. I purchased the house, and it was interesting because when I moved into the house, the day I was moving in, several neighbors came over and welcomed me to the neighborhood, white neighbors, neighborhood. I think I was the third African American in that neighborhood. The first was Dr. Kennedy, who was an educator, college professor, and the second was Dr. Lionel Coulter, who was also a professor, but he was also a probation officer, and then I was the third person in that area down there, Rolling Hills Highlands, just behind the drive-in theater. I experienced some discrimination here in San Pedro, but didn't linger on it, and most of that's gone now. San Pedro is a great place to live. It's a super place to live. Many people who have left San Pedro want to come back. But I had a great childhood here in San Pedro, and we did a lot of things in the community that they don't longer do. We every year we had the fair at 13th and Gaffey, where the Safeway Market is now. Back then it was part of the Boys Club football field, and I played football at the Boys Club. We had, of course, the Fisherman's Fiesta is always talked about, but also we had the Kiwanis Easter egg hunt at Peck Park, where they would have hundreds of kids there the day before Easter looking for Easter eggs in the park, young kids. And the grand prize was they had 2 golden eggs. If you found the golden egg, you got a free bicycle from King's Bicycle Shop. And then, of course, the big attraction was the Clyde Beatty Circus came to town every year on the train, a circus train along Front Street. And they had the tents there. And, of course, I grew up there in Rancho, just 2 or 3 blocks from where the circus was, and we'd go over there and try to sneak in. Didn't have any money to get in there, pay to get in. But, all the animals and the acts and so on and so forth. All those things are ingrained in my memory about growing up in San Pedro. And lots of fun things for kids to do.
My grandmother on the Italian side passed away when she was just not quite 103. And every Christmas or every holiday, I would go over and bake with her. And, she would bake umpteen trays of cookies. And she used to like to make this one dish that all my uncles would always wait in line for, all my great uncles would wait in line for, and that was called strussola, if I'm pronouncing it right. And to me, it was a lot of work. My favorite part of it was she'd make this batter or this dough, and she'd roll it out, and we'd sit there and cut. And then after we cut so many, she would fry it. And after she'd fry it, then she would cook it, drop it into hot honey. And then it would get all sticky and gooey, and you would form these molds on these plates, and then you'd sprinkle all these little sprinkled candies, and then that was it. And you'd cut it, but it'd be like cutting into something really hard, because it was all crispy and solid, but everybody liked it. It's not one of my favorite, to be truthful. My favorite was her Easter bread, because she every Easter would start making Easter breads. And I'd go over her house, and I would take her to the market sometimes to buy all the ingredients. And you'd go into her back bedroom, and there would be 25 Easter breads that she would be waiting to give out to people. Now I make them, and I still pass them out. And if you come to my house around before Easter, you'll find the Easter breads all around my house. So you give them out, but it's a tradition. It's a tradition that keeps on living, because I'm a firm believer, as long as you keep memories alive and try and relive those memories or keep traditions going, that there's still that part of those memories alive in you. And so I learned to bake from my grandmother from watching her. But I'm going to tell you, it's funny about recipes, especially with Italians. I'm going to be very honest. You can ask for a recipe, but don't be sure that you're going to get the complete recipe. They were very funny about that, very territorial with recipes. Like, they'll tell you, oh yes, I'll give you my recipe, but don't bank on it that it's the full recipe. They may leave out a little ingredient, and then you wonder why yours doesn't taste like theirs.
So where I live now, the house I'm in and how I got there, is a classic San Pedro story. So Connie and I were living in the Holy Trinity area in a really small house with 5 kids. And one of our neighbors a few blocks away, Mrs. Carroll, who had raised 5 kids and had sent all her kids to Holy Trinity, and so Connie and I had grown up with her kids. She says to her son, who used to date my wife, by the way, says, hey, Kevin, before we put this house up for sale, call the McCoskers and see if they want to buy it. So Kevin calls me one day. You can imagine getting a call from your wife's ex-boyfriend. And he says, hey, can you meet for coffee? I need to talk to you about my mom's house. I said, sure, I'll meet you. He says, my mom wants to sell you the house. I said, great. In 15 minutes, we decided on a price, and he said, she wants to carry back the paper. So we went down to the Hallmark store, which used to have those forms, and we did a trust deed, and we used an old-fashioned calculator to figure out what the interest would be. And Mrs. Carroll sold me her house on a price that we picked, me and her son picked, and she carried back the paper, no bank, no appraisal. And I say to her, Mrs. Carroll, when I give her the 10% down and we sign the papers, and I say, what if I don't pay you? And she says, oh, Timmy, I've known your parents, I've known your grandparents, I've seen you grow up, you'll pay me. And she knew my wife and loved my wife. And I actually have pictures, I have a couple of pictures, or my wife has a couple of pictures of Kevin, who had lived in the house, and my wife on the stairs of the house for the prom. And that's the house I still live in. Isn't that San Pedro?
I attended San Pedro High School in the 80s, class of 83, and we had a lot of fun in high school, both on campus and off campus. We'll keep it at that. But one of the best memory I had was the high school talent show in 1982. I imitated Elvis Presley, and the only thing was I didn't have a band. My plan was to sing All Shook Up. Didn't have a band, didn't have a costume. So I asked Pete Mazich, who had a band, and guitar player was John Berkovich, and the drummer was Silvio Filipovic. And they were already in a talent show. They were going to do a Doors rendition with Steve Hazard as Jim Morrison. So I thought, boy, if I can get Pete to say yes to back me up, then I'm in, right? I could do the Elvis thing. So he said, sure, no problem. So I remember going to his, he had a studio above his garage and rehearsing. And we got through once or twice. He said, it's fine, it'll be great. And I'm totally nervous because, the talent show, it's not just the talent show. It's an opportunity for students to get out of class, 4th period. And I can't remember if you had to pay like 50 cents or something, but the San Pedro High School auditorium had 1,000 students, and it was packed. So like a couple days before, I needed an outfit. So I went to my cousin's house, my cousin Leonard Ferrigno, and I don't know, he had white pants, he had white shoes, and I said, I can use those. And I had a white shirt or something. And so, but I didn't have a white belt. And so I thought, oh, it'll be fine. So I put it's time for the show. I even asked some of the cheerleaders, I need you to run up to the stage so I can hand you a rose. And so I remember being backstage and the pants weren't fitting right. So I asked my brother Dominic, I'm like, I don't have a belt. So he found this rope and he laced it through the back and tied it up for me so the pants wouldn't fall. And I was ready. And there was, Steve Hazard doing this thing, and Pete and the band guys were up there rocking out, doing the Doors, and next thing you know, it was my turn. And so they announced, now introducing Anthony Elvis Perosi. So I go out there, and it's kind of quiet. People are like, okay, what's this going to be? So Pete and the guys start playing, and I start singing the song. And, after the first I'm in love and pelvic thrust, I'm all shook up, the place went crazy. And so I thought, okay, I got the audience now. So did my thing, and I'm waiting for the cheerleaders, and I got the moves down, and sure enough, they come running up. I hand them a rose, and then I finished the song. The place is still going nuts, right? And the way that actually turned out is I won Best Audience Appeal. I won the talent show in 1982. So it was really a great memory for me. I'm in love. I'm all shook up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. How was that? Was that good? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You can have that one too.
It was December 17th, which happened to be my sister's birthday, so I remember the date. I was at choir practice, so I was not home. But we had gotten the Christmas tree, and we had, in the old Tanner house, there were almost floor-to-ceiling windows, sort of thing, and we put the tree right in front of those windows. Julia was 7, Cyrus was about 5.5. And she had gone upstairs. It was 7 o'clock or 7:30. I forget exactly when it was, but she had gone up to take a bath to go to bed. And Cyrus was sitting in a rocking chair right next to the tree, which was in front of these windows. And Greg had said to him, "You go up and get your sister so that we can light the tree." And he had gone up the stairs. He was halfway up the stairs when the Sansanena exploded. Well, when I came home, of course, we heard the explosion, and we all just said, "We're going home." And I was driving home, and of course, all you could smell was the oil and see the orange glow in the harbor. It was extremely frightening. Got home and walked into the house, and the windows had blown out. There were shards 12, 13 inches, because we measured them, that were 12, 13 inches long that had blasted across the living room into the dining room. The chair where our son had been sitting was covered with glass. And story after story after story you heard about how people just escaped being injured by that terrible explosion.
They immigrated to the United States sometime in the, I would say, early 1920s. My grandmother came from the state of Michoacan, and my grandfather came from the state of Jalisco. Interesting, their story is that when they came, they ended up working, specifically my grandfather worked for the Vanderlip estate, which is now present-day Terranea. And Frank Vanderlip really was actually quite fond of my grandfather and would invite him to bring even the younger kids, so they would kind of have time to play and roam around the property. And there's stories about my Uncle Joe, who to this day is still alive and with us. We call him the Duck, because he used to swim in Portuguese Bend, and they talk about those stories where they were just roaming unsupervised, and it was fun and safe, and I think that's a good story. But my grandmother, she was a strong woman. Again, she had 8 kids and was just at home supporting just my grandfather. But my grandfather, his story is interesting because he also worked for Consolidated Rock. So he was under the supervision of the Vanderlips at that estate. He was a gardener, but he also did cement work and brick work. So come to find out that later on, he was very instrumental in helping with the building of Holy Family Church in East Wilmington, which is fascinating. I didn't know that. My dad, who was born in 1929, always spouts off about, "Oh, I was in the first book to be baptized," and we're thinking, sure, Dad, that's a really good story. But when he passed a year and a half ago and we needed to get his records for the sacrament, it was just absolutely astonishing that he is in the first book. To be baptized in the year 1929 and to find out that my grandfather helped build that church just means volumes to me, especially since I'm a Catholic educator.
My sister and I kayak quite a bit now, and we go out to the West End, and something I never was able to explore when I was younger, because it's a little scary out there. If you ever experience the tip of the island on a small boat, you have waves from each side, and you're tossing and turning, so it's kind of fun. But and then the thought of a shark. You know, that's another thing you have in the back of your mind. There is a lot of those sharks around. Down near the dump, the island dump there, they're all down there too, swimming around. So you're like, ooh. My sister Jill, we camp at this one place called Cabrillo. It has this rock like right in the middle of it, and she goes. She was telling the story that she was climbing up this rock and then jumping into the water. It was right off the beach. And so one time she climbed up the rock and was sitting there for a little bit, and she jumped off, and mid-jump, a shark was swimming by. She landed right on top of that shark. I mean, we would see the sand sharks swimming by, but all of a sudden they do come up. She landed right on top of that shark, just shot off.
So during World War II, many people from the islands off of Split went to Egypt for safety. And ironically, both of my parents were in Egypt at the same time. And there was, I think the camps were lettered A and B. And my mom was in Camp A, and I believe my dad was in Camp B, or vice versa. My mom was 5, my dad was 9. And they were there with their families. And basically, they were there. I know my dad went to school there, and he and his sister also sang in a choir, a kids' choir that actually sang for King Farouk at the time, which was pretty amazing. And when he talked about it, those were some of the better times for him because he really enjoyed singing. A great story was, though, prior to leaving the island, my grandmother, who was there, my mom's mom, who was there, raising her kids, because my grandfather was already here. He came prior to the war. The Germans took over their house, and so they lived in the attic. And she cooked and cleaned for them. So the soldiers really trusted her, and so one of the soldiers there thought that my mom resembled his daughter, so he really liked my mom and just took a liking to the family. Their island had a curfew, so they allowed her to go out and take the kids out, go shopping, things like that, visit some family members. And she had it in her mind that she was gonna leave. And so they went into the hillside. And the hillsides are very similar to the PV hillsides here. And somebody in the family made all the kids slippers, white slippers. And my mom remembers this like it was yesterday, and she was the youngest one. And she said they went to a family member or a friend's house, and it was after curfew, and they just kept the house dark, and I guess soldiers were patrolling and saw a white slipper and questioned them, like, what are you doing here? And they said, oh, it got late, it's dark, we were just gonna stay here, spend the night. And they said, no, you need to go home. So they went back home. Following week, they did it again, and they escaped to Bari. And then from Bari, they went to Egypt. And it was just amazing what my grandmother went through just to get her young kids to safety.
Proud to say I'm a real San Pedran, first generation born here. I am the first also of college education from that family, and happy to be that. I was born in an era where the women actually had great opportunities in San Pedro because the fishing industry really was the economic opportunity of the area. And I can honestly say it was the fishing industry that built our houses, our churches, our schools, and our community at that time. But more so, every woman had the opportunity to work if she was willing to put on that white uniform and clean fish. But at least she had a job. And the nice thing is all nationalities worked together on those lines, and my mother was quite proud of that job. Because of that, I was kind of considered a latchkey kid because my sisters and brothers were much older than me. And so I hung out at Mary Starr Elementary School, or high school, after school. And I must say my art career started with that because the nuns would have me doing bulletin boards all day after school. And that's where my art career started. So also I speak of the women's part of this because our fathers were out to sea, and the women genuinely ran this town. And they had opportunities because they had to run the town on their own without husbands around, or at least our portion of the world, that they prided themselves in working together to raise each other's kids. So we only had one rule when I raised my kids, and that was, if you plan on doing anything, plan on getting caught, because I will know before you get home. And that's the basic Pedro rule, that mothers will know before you get home, and that's the way we were raised.
When my wife and I got married over 47 years ago, I was a truck driver for the Daily Breeze, and we wanted to find a home that we could afford. And so we looked at a lot of different places, and we found a home in Wilmington. In all honesty, I probably was not all that familiar. I delivered some papers to Wilmington, but not that familiar with the community. And I probably stayed awake a lot the first 2 weeks we were there, waiting for something bad to happen. I'd caught on some of that bad vibrations that were out there about the community. Needless to say, nothing happened. And what I discovered after a while, that I was surrounded by great neighbors. And I soon found my church at St. Peter and Paul, which is the second oldest church in Los Angeles. And what's sort of interesting about it, or I think it is, there are offshoots of that, are Mary Starr, St. Margaret Mary's, and there are others. But Wilmington quickly became my home and a place I loved. And my wife has told me we're not moving anywhere. I'm not moving all this stuff. You can imagine. So we were in Wilmington at our first house for probably the first 3 years we lived there, and then we moved to another home in Wilmington, and we've been there for over 44 years now. So it's fantastic. So much of my extended family, I feel, is in Wilmington and throughout the harbor area. But it seems like wherever I go, whatever part of Wilmington, and it's a small community. I think we're maybe 12 square miles. That there's people that I know, that I've interacted with, that I can call friends or make a phone call to. It's been actually a wonderful experience.
Ev was a young girl who came to our club when she was in elementary, middle school. Broken home. Mom was the main provider with 5 siblings. She was the oldest, and she basically took care of her siblings when her mom was doing whatever was going on. She left for a couple of years because they moved away, came back into the harbor and said, I want to come to the club. I missed 90-something days of my freshman year in high school because I was taking care of the kids. And so we got her into our college-bound program. She finished her 9th grade with a 0.8 GPA. She just dove in big time. She basically had to do 4 years of high school in 3 years. She graduated with a 3.2 GPA, worked her tail off. Staff did a great job supporting her the whole way. And then, when it came to getting accepted into college, I think she applied to 6 colleges. She didn't receive 1 acceptance letter. So my staff called each of the universities and said, we just want to wonder why Ev didn't make it in. I said, well, she made it in. We sent her the acceptance letter. Well, her mom was throwing away all the acceptance letters. She didn't want her to go to college. She wanted to take care of her siblings. So we were able to get her out of that situation, got her to her university. She graduated. Took 6 years, but she graduated. Called her, you got to come back and you got to take care of the kids that we're just like you. You're the right person. And she came back, started in a mid-level position, and eventually became a site director for our club. It's amazing how many of our alumni come back and serve the kids who are just like them, and that's just one of dozens of stories like that that really stands out.
So my parents were born in Mississippi, primarily Starksville, in a little community called Rock Hill, which is pretty segregated. It's all African American, and that kind of led to them growing up in a very segregated place. So most of their life they had to deal with segregated policies, separate water fountains, separate restaurants, separate entrances to restaurants, separate schools, in most cases inferior accommodations. And so when they became of age and they needed to get jobs, it was very difficult. The really only options were something illegal like selling moonshine or being some type of indentured servant. My dad took the plunge and moved west and lived with my mom's sister until he was able to find a job. And he was very surprised at how different San Pedro was. He came directly to San Pedro. At the time, San Pedro probably wasn't perfect, but it was a very diversified place. And that diversity allowed, I think, San Pedro to thrive where they needed to use all bodies, not just a portion of the economy. And so he started off basically doing side jobs, and then he partnered with this Yugoslavian guy named Gustavo. My dad called him Goosey. And they were able to build cabinets mainly for kitchens and do construction work, and which ultimately led to them getting contracts with Long Beach Naval Shipyard, and they became fully employed at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. So it allowed them to experience something he would have never experienced in the segregated South, which ultimately led to him making enough money to send for my two sisters who were born in Mississippi. I was ultimately born here. So I have very little recollection of the South other than going back on family vacations. And so most of my parents' child raising was based on the South, which means that they were very strict and they were concerned about us like going outside the neighborhood, because if you did that in Mississippi, the girls could get raped or the boys not come home, they could get hanged. So it was a very strict environment that I grew up in, very religious environment. So oftentimes when my friends who I met here would come over, they're like, wow, your parents are so strict. But in a strange kind of way, most of my friends like coming over the house. Maybe they just like following us and seeing us get spanked all the time, or they like the structure that my parents had. So my parents were surprised that I had friends that were not all black when I would bring them by the house. So, San Pedro, again, was very integrated. And so, you grow up, you play baseball, basketball, and football at Peck Park or some of the local places, and everyone in your team doesn't look like you. So I had white friends who were primarily Croatian, Italian friends. I had Asian friends. One of my best friends was George Vidal, who was Filipino. I had Samoan friends, and my parents were shocked, not just shocked, that white parents would let their white kids come and play with us. And my friends, I would go over their house, they weren't shocked at all that a black kid could go over their house. So it was just like hanging out in the neighborhood. I'm not saying San Pedro was perfect, but it just wasn't what they were expecting when they left the segregated South.
So when my dad's family first moved here, my grandfather started working for my grandmother's uncle Vince DiMeglio at Ocean Fish. And there was a healthy rivalry between the Ocean Fish guys and the State Fish guys, and they'd all come from Isca and knew each other. And so my uncle would tell the story of my grandfather would make the cioppino, the State Fish guys would steal the cioppino and eat it. And so one day my grandfather decided to play a practical joke on the state fish guys. So he made the cioppino as he always did, and he left it for a while unattended and left time for it to be stolen, as it was. And he gave the state fish guys time to eat it. And then he picked up a bag and walked down to State Fish, and the guys are sitting there, sitting back, patting their stomachs, toothpicks, saying, you know, oh, Dominic, that was your best batch. It was delicious. And my grandfather empties this dirty bag he has, and it's a bunch of dead feral cats from the fish markets, and says, I hope you liked it. It was cat. And as my uncle tells the story, the guys all stood up, ran to the water's edge, retched into the harbor. And now I have to say, I can't imagine that my grandfather would actually make cioppino with cats, because preparing it would be almost as disgusting as eating it. But I don't put it past my grandfather to use cats as a prop for his practical joke. And that was one of my uncle's favorite stories to tell.
So my mom's family originally from Zacatecas, Mexico, which is also towards the middle of Mexico. Jalisco, Zacatecas is a big place. Her parents are from there, and they migrated to Mexicali, Mexico, to, you know, better their future and pick crops and stuff over there. They were picking cotton and stuff like that. That was the big thing in Mexicali. And my dad, grandpa would tell my mom about how beautiful the United States was, because my grandfather worked in the Bracero in 1940 something. When the war was here, they hired all the Mexicans to come over legally and work. So my grandfather worked all over the United States, Washington, and he'd tell stories about how cold it was and they weren't used to it and stuff like that. And he always told my mom how beautiful United States was, how beautiful it was. So my mom, when she was 15, started working over there, picking olives, and they moved back from Mexicali to Ensenada. So she'd get jobs and jobs, and she always helped run a store that my grandfather owned. And when she was 16, she decided to come. She said, it's not for her over there. Some guy wanted to marry her, and she said, I don't want to get married. She told my grandpa, I want to go to the United States. So she made it down to the United States, and 16 years old, and stayed with some other people. Someone knew somebody in Wilmington, which I think the Andrade family. There's a couple Andrade families, but I don't know. I'm not sure which one it was. She stayed with for a couple of days, got a job and got an apartment right quick. Like in a month's time, she did all that. My dad's from San Luis Potosí, Mexico, which is in the middle of Mexico. It's the biggest state of Mexico. It borders up, I think, 5 or 6 different states. And he came down to Tijuana, but they had a guy from there that lived in Tijuana, and they would stay there. They'd get a job and work, and then they got their legal residency or be able to cross the border. And he came to Wilmington. He had other family members here from Wilmington. The Vigils were already here. They're a pretty big family in Wilmington, and they were somehow related to him. So they boarded him for a while, and he got a job, and he did good. He had a lot of different jobs. He worked at Wixon Brothers, which is owned, it was a fiberglass company in Signal Hill, which was owned by the Pina family from Wilmington, which is also a big family. And he worked there for a long time. He also worked at a ceramic place. It's called California Originals. And if you remember back in the days, people used to smoke, and these had little figurines and all these beautiful things, and they used to make all that stuff there. And it was a real big company back in the days. And it's a place where all the Mexican people worked from in the area. So I guess my mom worked there, and I guess that's where they met, and the whole love story happened or whatever. And they got married, and then I was born.
So my grandparents were from the northwestern part of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. That's where they grew up. And so they wound up, working and living in San Pedro since 1920. My grandparents and my dad lived at 584 West 9th Street, which is the home of Jay Trainees today. My grandfather, Ricardo, became a U.S. citizen in 1930. And then on December 5th, 1933, Prohibition ended. And so there was opportunities because the Alcoholic Beverage Committee issued basically licenses and lotteries to buy liquor licenses. So my grandfather put in for a liquor license. He was granted one in 1934. And in 1935, they opened a place on 10th and Grand named Pal's Cafe. Why Pal's, I have no idea, but it was a bar. And the licenses in those days carried certain conditions. They carried food on premise conditions.
Well, they didn't have a restaurant, they didn't have a kitchen. So what do? You have a license, you have a bar, but you don't have a restaurant. So my grandmother would make plates of food and bring them over to the bar to be compliant with the license. She would make charcuteries, cheeses, different meats, sandwiches, some salads. She would make these little sausage picnic meatballs. And so she would go over there 3-4 times a day and fill the bar full of food, because if the ABC showed up, you better have food on premise. And adjacent to that property were 2 empty alleys. So they got the idea, bocce, which is a very popular sport from that era and from that culture, they made 2 bocce alleys. So they had the bar and they had 2 bocce alleys. And they operated that bar from 1935 until 1954. My grandfather passed in 1952. But my father, growing up and being in the bar business with his father, and he always had in the back of his mind that he wanted to open a restaurant and combine the restaurant and a bar and have a dining house, a dinner house. That was very big in those days. So there was an all-star team, a softball all-star team in San Pedro called the Mary Star All-Stars. And they played from 1947 until 1959. They won 5 World Series, and they won 3 in a row, 1952, 1953, 1954. In 1953, they won the World Championship in Phoenix, Arizona. And after they won the championship, they were invited to a banquet in celebration of their championship victory at a place called the Green Gables, which was a very famous restaurant in Phoenix. And my dad went there, and the place was basically built like a French Tudor castle with a lot of wood, a lot of used brick. And my dad fell in love with the place. He said, wow. He goes, I have to create a place like this and build a restaurant and open a restaurant in San Pedro. This is the style, this is what I want. So he made his own drawings. He had someone take some pictures for him. He asked the owner if he could have a menu, and he took all that back with him to San Pedro. And when he got back to San Pedro, he called his good friend, who was an architect, developer, a USC grad, by the name of John Galleretto, who built many, many, many homes in the peninsula area during that era. And he told John, he said, I want to build a restaurant on 9th Street, and I want it to look like this. And he says, can you do it? So after a couple of weeks, John Galleretto says, Pepe, come down to my office. He goes, I got some drawings for you. So he had drawings, and they went over them. And he said, I can do it. I got to take it to the city. I got to get it approved. It's going to take a year, but I think we can do this. And my dad said, go for it. So in the meantime, my dad worked on getting the license transferred, the ABC license, the liquor license transferred from 10th and Grand over to 584 West 9th Street. He successfully completed that side of it. And they started construction in 1954. And finally, on August 25th, 1955, Pepe's was opened. And it was a big success from day one.
Mayor Hahn appointed me harbor commissioner, and he had several goals in mind, but a couple of them related directly to me as a commissioner. One was to see how I could bring the community together with the port to work together for the betterment of this community and to solve some of the serious issues that the port was causing for the communities. I never see a reason why we can't come together on something. I really want to choose positive, peaceful means to bring people together, because I feel everybody has something to say. We may not agree, but we can find a way to make a solution happen, even though it's a compromise, to help things move forward. We have to keep the goal in mind. And so I thought that this was going to be not a big deal for me because had done it a lot. It turned out to be a major challenge because I'd never hit the hardcore of the community that really were confrontational, that really believed in their cause and were willing to fight for it. And I'd never worked with that kind of person, those kinds of people before, which is fine. It was a good experience for me. But I also learned that the issues were very complicated, very complicated. environment. I mean, you don't just say, okay, we're going to clean up the environment tomorrow. I mean, you start talking about, well, what's in the air and what is causing this and that. It's a very scientific issue and very complicated and requires very smart people to be able to understand it and then to communicate it. So it was a tough one. And I mean, there were all kinds of pollution that I'd never heard of before. So I had to learn a lot. I really learned a lot. But those were hard ones, and we worked on all of that. And I think when I look back at it, I'm saying, well, I don't know. People hated the Community Advisory Committee. There were people who hated it. You know, they didn't want to deal that way. They didn't want to try to come to some kind of peaceful way of doing things. They just wanted this stuff to stop right now, you know. And we couldn't do that. There's no way. That wasn't going to happen. And the other issue was this part of the west side of the main channel to the port, or the harbor, was half industrial. And the industrial had some very serious issues. They had toxic tanks and trains coming through, and there were shipbuilding, and there was shipbuilding and all kinds of things that were just polluting all over the place. Under the ground, in the air, noise pollution. Well, we did win that one because the port has pulled out all their industrial on the west side, and it's now designated for the community. So that was a big win.
In 1902, my dad came to America. And at that time, the immigration system did not require a passport or a visa. He came through America via Ellis Island. He came here and went to Chicago. He stayed there for a few years, and then he went to Arizona. From Arizona, he met my mother. He stayed in Arizona a few years, and then my mother had a child, and once my brother was born, they came to San Pedro. My dad came out here and he told me, Nick, when I came to San Pedro, I thought the pavement was made out of gold. Instead, I encountered unpaved streets. He came into San Pedro and opened up the first bakery called the Liberty Bakery. He had that several years. And then he changed occupation and went into the restaurant business. He opened his first restaurant across the street on Beacon and across the street from the City Hall Police Department. The police department was on top and the fire department was down below at that time. At that time, I entered the picture. I worked with my dad since I was 12 years old. I was so short, I was only 4 feet 8 inches at the time, and I stood on a crate to make hamburgers and hot dogs with my dad. I worked there all through junior high, and about 8 o'clock every night when I did work there during the week, the policeman who was off duty at the time came into the restaurant and said, Tom, Nikki has to go home. It's 8 o'clock and she has to go to school. So they brought me home every time I worked nights with my dad at 8 o'clock. And when I was home, I was safe and sound. I felt so honored and so privileged to work with my dad side by side until I was out of high school. I had a wonderful relationship with my dad.